Hello, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network podcast. And in case you're not familiar with us, the Sacred Inclusion Network is a collection of people who are actively exploring the integration of what we call diversity and spirituality. You can find more about us by going to our website, sacredinclusion.com. Today, this afternoon, it's my privilege to interview Michael F. Brown, who's the president of the School for Advanced Research, also known as SAR, which is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're a research institution that supports Native American artists in innovative social research in anthropology and related fields. Michael is the author of 6 books, including Upriver, The Turbulent Times of an Amazonian People, and in a completely different book called Channeling Zone, American Spirituality in an Anxious Age. Michael Brown's scholarly interests include the indigenous people of North and South America, magic and religion, and dilemmas associated with the protection of cultural property of Native peoples worldwide. And I'm particularly interested in talking to Michael about, religion and Native spirituality and how it contrasts to so-called New Age spirituality. But we'll see how it goes. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Angela. It's nice to be here.
Michael, I know that it's an incomplete list of your many interests, but we're concentrating on the spirituality and religion aspect. And I'm just wondering, what about your kind of pre-professional background made you informed to eventually study these subjects in a kind of academic or formal way?
It's a fair question. It's like a lot of things in life. I went to college. I was a financial aid student at an Ivy League university, a little bit out of my depth. I came from Kansas City, and I was sort of taken under the wing of, at the time, arguably the nation's foremost Native American anthropologist, Alfonso Ortiz, who's a Tewa Indian from Okea-Wingate Pueblo here in New Mexico. And Alfonso, I took a class from him. He asked me if I'd be his research assistant at the same rate of pay I was getting for like mopping the floors of the freshman dining hall. So it was a pretty easy decision. And I did work for him. And then he helped me get some summer jobs on the Navajo reservation where I taught school. Basically, I think I was taught by the kids, but I was nominally the instructor. And one thing led to another. And part of me said, I can't believe you can make a living doing this. And when I graduated, I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which now has one of the best anthropology departments in the country. So, but I ended up not working with Native North Americans because an opportunity arose to work in Peru. And I spent a couple of summers in the Andes, but found that I really was gravitating to the upper Amazon, so that is to say east of the Andes Mountains. Very different people, very different environment. And so that's where my dissertation doctoral work was undertaken.
And we're going to talk about that because, I would imagine the 2 years you spent with the Awajún, did I say it right? I probably messed it up.
Well, yeah. So historically, until fairly recently, they were known as the Awajún. Their own name for themselves is Awajún.
Awajún.
And so in my earlier work, says Awajún because, it's sort of like Navajo and Dene. And, increasingly we use the ethnonym that the people themselves prefer, and the Awajún prefer to be called Awajún. So they're Jivaroan people. They're related to the Jivaro or Shuar people of Ecuador, especially known for shrinking human heads, the heads of their victims. That's ancient history, certainly was ancient history by the time I started working there in the mid-1970s.
I worked at Princeton University. You don't know this. And I know that Princeton University is a very, how shall we say, left-brain place in many respects. So I'm just fascinated why you became an anthropologist. I wouldn't expect that. I wouldn't expect there would be any anthropologists at Princeton.
Oh, no, it was a small department. It was fairly new to Princeton and still to this day, I think is fairly small in comparison to, say, sociology at Princeton, which is a real big powerhouse department. But it was an exciting time for the program. And Alfonso was a young PhD. He got his PhD at the University of Chicago. He later, once he was promoted at Princeton, he ended up winning a MacArthur fellowship and relocated to the University of New Mexico, in part because he wanted his children to be initiated as Tewa. He wanted them to be able to participate in the religious life of his pueblo. So he became a really high-profile public personality among Native American anthropologists, and we were friends until till he died in 1997.
So I can imagine that 2 years that you spent with the Awajún, it might have been a sort of a seminal time. I mean, I hearken to my own experience of living in a Japanese dojo, and it was very different than anything that I had been aware of. You're trained as an anthropologist. You've studied. You've read a lot about Native peoples, indigenous people. But I imagine just to spend that two years in the jungle, entering into it, you probably had to unlearn a few things just to be able to just be present and observe things.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assumption?
It is. And as I explained in Upriver, which is really a kind of 40-year look at that experience, I had planned to work somewhere else and actually had a grant to work in a different part of Peru. It's a long story about why I decided to relocate. So this is a case where, and you couldn't do this today. I mean, I literally walked into a village of a people I knew almost nothing about, and I sort of said, "Take me to your leader, and by the way, can I live here?" And to my astonishment, they said, "Sure." And I think their goal was actually to study me. I mean, I was like their pet gringo or something. And I mean, they were coming into contact with the Western world. It was fairly recent. They had a bilingual school there, and I think they were just,
they're curious.
In that sense, there was an exchange. I think they were curious about me, and they're a very lively, smart, resilient people. But when I walked in, and I spoke Spanish, but I didn't speak their language, I had to start from scratch. I'd actually studied a different language, and so I had to unlearn a lot of things. And but that's what anthropologists do. That's what cultural anthropologists do. One of the challenges, in fact, is learning to suspend judgment about certain kinds of things and try and see the logic of practices and beliefs through the eyes of your hosts, to understand how they make sense of their world. And it's hard sometimes. Obviously, it challenges you at a lot of different levels, and everybody has their own cultural, I don't know, limit. And for me, it was certain kinds of foods. So I think I mentioned in the book that for them, one of their favorite foods, kind of like eating caviar or something for us, is our palm grubs, which are about, an inch and a half long. These fat grubs, often eaten while they're still alive, and you just sort of deal with their crunchy heads. And I mean, I tried it, and I sort of understood it as a flavor that one could acquire a taste for, but it wasn't going to happen with me. And the reverse thing happened. So I once had some cheese. I'd sort of husbanded this, some foods that I was familiar with. I had some canned Dutch cheese or something, and some people came to my house, and so I shared my food with them, just as they always shared their food with me, and they're very generous in that sense. And they put this stuff in their mouths. There were like 6 or 7 people, and they immediately spit it out on the floor and said, "My God, what is that? That's disgusting." And that's what relativism is all about. You get a sense of their own limitations or their own boundaries that they don't want to cross. And
no, I'm struck by the adventurousness quality of you. Now, you're an older man. Maybe you're not as adventurous now.
No,
but just the
not.
mere fact of, in the book, you mentioned that you had this image of you like being Carlos Castaneda or something, studying with a shaman. And I know later in life, you actually took some classes in channeling. So that's quite a statement in cultural relativism or adventurism or it's enforced naivete, let's say.
That's right. Well, I actually think, I consider myself lucky because having spent 2 years plus working with the Awajún, it prepped me. There's a kind of habit of mind that's associated with ethnography, with studying another population. And in some ways you're pushed into that by a truly alien culture. I mean, all your assumptions about what works, how the world works, how you get things done, what things mean, have to be they get thrown out the window, and you're really dependent on people to explain or to help you make sense of their lived experience. Once I had done that, it was fairly easy to do the same thing with channelers. And I'll be happy to tell you how I went from the Awajún to channeling. But I had, I guess there's an element of adventurousness, but there's also just an element of stubborn, the fear of failure. You've done all this training and then you're sent off to the field and you're really pretty much out of touch. This was long before the internet. I'd go for 6 or 7 months without seeing a telephone. And, those old fashioned letters writing home to my parents or whatever. And, you just learn to, you learn to adapt and run with it. Of course, the more facility one acquires in a language, the more people know you, the more you know them, it gets to be better. The Awajún can be very witty. And one of the hardest things about learning, and maybe you experience this in Japan, you're known, you're a good conversationalist, and suddenly in this other language, you're a complete idiot. And I'd have, after I'd been there 6 months, people would come into my house and they'd hold up a 2-year-old and they say, well, he's only 2 and he speaks better than you do. What's wrong with you? And, it's humbling. And, but then eventually you acquire that kind of facility. The first time I told a joke in Awajún and made people laugh, it was just like this triumph of, cultural competence. And I have to say the language, like a lot of oral cultures, there were just very many levels of complexity to their language. There was formal speaking styles and informal speaking styles, and I don't claim ever to have acquired competence in all those levels. My linguistic ability in Awajún was basic, but
I'm impressed. I'm impressed that you learned it to begin with. But let me ask you a little question off script. My experience is that humor doesn't travel. So I'm curious as to what, maybe you can give me an example of an Awajún humor that would not make any sense to you.
Well, some of it's maybe too scatological for your audience, but I'm trying to think of an example. Well, all right, here's an example of their humor. When you're at the staff of life of the Awajún people, especially of men, was beer that's made from manioc or cassava. And so every day a woman, harvests the tubers, peels them, cleans them, chops them up, cooks them, then chews them up and spits them out, which back into a big tub, which helps to turn some of the starches into sugar that enhances fermentation. So when you're at a party, they're very individualistic people. So if you had to leave for a little while, at the end of the day, for example, I would go to every man and I would say, I'm leaving, I'm going to sleep, continue drinking or continue getting drunk. And they would say, okay. So I had to relieve myself because you drink vast quantities of this stuff. One's bladder feels a sense of urgency. And so the polite thing to do was to say to my host, Yatsuhu, my brother, Shikipaktahai, I'm going out to pee, basically. And so this guy, this particular host was kind of a jokester. And he said, Ayu, Puhusa Shikipakta, which literally means squatting, urinate. So he was insulting my manhood, right? And I didn't get the reference. And I said, okay, I will do that. And everybody started laughing hysterically. And then they explained to me, hey, you dork, he was just pulling you, jerking your chain. And then, 6 months later, I got to pull the same trick on him. And it was a great personal satisfaction associated with that.
I'm going to try to make this leap between channeling and your experience with the people. And
I don't know how we're going from what I just explained to channeling, but
I'm going to get there. Now, that a lot of American, I'll call them New Agers, they have this kind of like naivete about Indigenous people.
That's right.
Including naivete about Indigenous spirituality. So, I guess the Carlos Castaneda book is like a perfect example, but you can go anywhere. You can see, certain people going to sweat lodges and things like that. And they think they get it, so, so you have the experience that you write about in the book with shamans and, I guess I'll call them medicine people. and you have this other experience of, I'll call them New Agers, doing what externally looks like similar types of things, but I imagine it's a completely different framework. And I'm giving you like license to speak, but maybe you can speak about broadly about what the difference in perspective would be.
Well, let me explain first why I went from the Awajún to channeling in the United States. By the late 1980s, the Shining Path and a different revolutionary group called the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA in Spanish, had become really significant factors in Peru. And Americans, I found myself in a couple of situations that were both dangerous to me, but equally important, dangerous to say, people who gave me shelter. I didn't feel that it was ethical to, present a danger to people who were being nice to me, because after I left, maybe the guerrillas show up the next day and say, "Why? What are you doing with this gringo?" and so on. Yeah. So I felt that I had to suspend my work in Peru for a number of years. And as it happened, I was finishing a book in Santa Fe, and this was, say, 1990, more or less, and it was really almost the peak of the metaphysical movement or New Age movement in Santa Fe. And I ran into a lot of people doing shamanism, doing channeling, doing related things. And I wasn't reading anything by anthropologists that kind of dealt with it with the same level of distancing and I must say respect that we take for granted when we're talking about indigenous religion. So I felt there was a space there for somebody who really looks at it in other words, there were two kinds of books at the time. There was the I was lost and I found myself in the New Age movement. That is, I became a believer. And then there were the skeptics who just made fun of New Agers. And there were books, but nothing really in the middle that just played it totally straight as an ethnographic challenge. So I decided to move in that direction and channeling, but because of my prior experience, I just didn't feel comfortable looking at people doing things like sweat lodges or neo-shamanism. I just didn't feel that I could be fair-minded about it because of the cultural appropriation associated with it, which at the time was starting to emerge as a major topic among Native people, American Indians and indigenous people from other parts of the world. Like, you're stealing our religion, right? And corrupting our religion and misrepresenting our religion. The thing about channeling is that it really is a continuation of a spiritualist tradition that goes back at least to the 19th century in the United States. I mean, I'm told that Abraham Lincoln had seances in the White House once or twice, in the mid 19th century, and it may even go back to the 18th century in Europe. So it had deep roots in the West, and therefore, though some of the people I spent time with and interviewed and observed were, claimed to be channeling Native Americans and that sort of thing, I felt I could live with that. So I picked channeling. Also, the movement itself is, and it certainly was at that time, so diverse that I didn't see how one individual could do a really fine-grained study of that level of diversity. So I had to specialize in one thing. And there's a long literature in anthropology about spirit mediumship and so on that I could draw on. So I did what anthropologists do. I went to events. Sometimes I did formal interviews. If they were public events, I didn't feel that I had to identify myself. They might be in the public library here in Santa Fe or around a coffee table in somebody's house in upstate New York or Western Massachusetts, where I taught at the time. And if people asked me why I was there, who I was, I would explain. But now when I did interviews, for ethical reasons and other reasons, I had to say what I was doing, who I was and what my goals were. And I was amazed at the people's willingness to talk to me. I think a lot of them thought this was like a personal quest on my part, and I was, abandoning my scientific background, but that wasn't really true. I did find that I liked a lot of the people that I was observing and interacting with and interviewing. They were often smart and funny, and some of them took themselves very seriously. Others didn't. And we could talk about my ultimate take on that, but I really enjoyed myself a lot, and I saw a whole range of different types of channeling activities. And also, when I could, I interviewed the audience members or people who were there. I tracked them down. We do interviews in person or on the phone. And then I did, I think, as you were alluding to, go to a how-to channeling workshop.
What was that like? I'm curious about that.
It was fabulous. Actually, it was just in a home here in Santa Fe. It was taught by a woman who I didn't know very well, but was smart and lively. I mean, what it really was about, and it served me well, this is one thing that I think I did benefit from, was just letting go of the rational mind and just kind of getting much more in touch with my intuitive side, and not worrying about whether it was silly or absurd or confusing or frightening, and just kind of rolling with it. And once you get into it, it's there's a kind of a play. It's funny. Some of the reviewers didn't like the fact that I talk about channelism as having elements of spiritual play, because and I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense. I meant that a lot of the people who attended these events, the whole question of belief, which was something that a lot of outsiders always, how can people believe this? Well, a lot of the people I met, they suspended belief. They didn't necessarily believe it. They said, I want to experience something radically different, and maybe it means something to me, and maybe it doesn't. And what's wrong with just checking it out, or being in the presence of somebody channeling these entities? And maybe at the end of the day, I move on to some other form of spirituality. And even some of the practitioners. So one thing that I should make clear is I pretty much stayed away from the high-profile sort of celebrity channelers, the Jay-Z Knights of the world, because that just seemed fraught, with issues about money and power and dependence and so on. A lot of though I did go to one workshop run by Kevin Ryerson, who's pretty well known in that field, and he's a very witty guy, funny, speaks in different voices, and seemed to. I mean, there was a lot of laughter in his in those events, but mostly I was working with in a very sort of down home. I might be like I said, sitting around a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a half dozen people, or going to an event with 10 or 15 people. Very little money was involved. People did it because they believed in it. They witnessed it because they were interested. Maybe there was a love donation of $10 or something like that, but people were not being exploited.
There's something you said that's interesting. You were saying you were able to let go of your rational mind, which is, it's quite a statement in a way for a scientist, I'll call it. And I know that you studied magic, or you have an interest in magic, I'll say.
Yeah.
And I was really struck. I read this article that you wrote for this journal in the Anthropology of Religion, a handbook.
Mm.
And, you talk about magic and you talk about sorcerers and such in the book Upriver. But let me just read you this quote, and I'll just have you just sort of talk about it. You write, "It's no longer possible to think of magic as an atavistic trait doomed to eventual extinction. Instead, it may be an enduring quality of the human imagination." In the same article, you conclude that it is by now clear that traditional distinctions between magic, science, and religion have outlived their utility, and in fact represent an obstacle to deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm. So the background to that was at the time in the 1970s. So there's a whole history, which is what's the distinction between science and magic, or religion and magic?
Right.
And some of it was valid. That is, magic is typically defined by the expectation of some kind of practical outcome, as opposed to religion, which is more diffuse and has to do with your relationship to spiritual beings, which may or may not at any given moment involve some kind of practical result. So when I was with the Awajún, they practiced magic to make their plants grow, to hunt successfully, to attract people of the opposite sex. There was a lot of love magic that was practiced. And so it's part of and consistent with what we would call their religion. But anthropologists then felt that some of them dismissed magic as a kind of bogus science, or flawed science, or false science. So there were these three categories: science, which was empirical and produced practical results; magic, which was, made up and flawed and was focused on practical results, and then religion, which is much more broad and collective in this. And the other thing is that religion is a community event. Magic tends to be an individual practice as opposed to a collective practice. And that was certainly true among the Awajún. But what struck me, so I wrote against that. I mean, as I spent more time studying magic in the field, I was struck by how businesslike people were about it. So there wasn't a lot of faith involved, or there was a certain amount of faith. I mean, I'll give you an example. This is a part of the Amazon that has alluvial soils, and so you don't find rocks lying around. I mean, it's kind of interesting. And so people, for example, sharpening stones had to be hauled in from 25 or 30 miles away because there literally were no rocks in the soil. It was all sandy soil. So when you're butchering an animal, let's say you've killed a game animal and you're butchering it and you find a stone, like a gallstone or a stone in its body, they would say, this rare item, a relatively rare item, is associated with a successful hunt. So maybe this stone has power to attract animals to me and help me become or remain a successful hunter. And so there was a whole protocol for how you take care of it and empower it and how you use it. But people said, well, I'd go out and try it, and if I used it 5 times and nothing happened, I just throw it away. I mean, it wasn't like this awesome thing that they feared or had tremendous respect for. It was the practical nature of their approach to it that impressed me. So I even thought of writing. I mean, I wrote a book about that. I'm not even using the word magic, but something like paratechnology. But it's just sort of awkward and clumsy, and magic just has this long-standing place in anthropological thought. So I decided against that. There's still times when I wonder whether I should have gone in that other direction. And then there's the problem that these other models of magic couldn't explain the fact that magic could and does produce practical effects. So let me give you one example, and I think I mentioned it in that article you're referring to, Angelo. There's a plant that it's been so many years I can't even remember the Latin name, but it's a fast reproducing aquatic plant called putza in their language. And some of their magical songs to help their chickens and other domesticated fowl reproduce quickly would use that as a metaphor. That is, let my chickens, let my hens be like the putza plant, which reproduces really quickly. And they would actually feed this particular plant to their livestock to help them reproduce. Well, it turns out that the plant is very high in certain trace minerals and protein, so that I think it's an empirical fact that feeding this to domestic fowl helps them reproduce more successfully. Now, what's the relationship? Does that mean that it actually is science after all, and we shouldn't have called it magic in the first place? And yet it has these attributes of magic. It appears in magical songs. Its relationship to the outcome is more metaphorical. So let my livestock, let my domestic fowl be like the putza plant, not this plant contains trace elements and protein that are nourishing my animals. But the result is the same. And so I think in a world in which, science works partly, it's hard to imagine doing science without literacy. Why? Because science is always based on other people being able to reproduce the results that a given scientist obtains. And if a given, it's like the cold fusion thing. I mean, the scientists claim to have achieved cold fusion in a lab, but nobody else seemed to able to reproduce their results. So there are grave questions. How do they communicate that study? They do it through writing. And in a society without writing, the Awajún are literate now, by the way, but historically they were not. It was an entirely oral society, like virtually every indigenous society. There was no way of sort of testing in some dispassionate, systematic way the accuracy of certain kinds of claims. So some of the things that they did were magic were largely symbolic. Do I really believe that the tooth of a porpoise will when brought into contact with the object of one's desire, make her go crazy with love and lust for the. I don't believe that, and I saw no evidence. I'm not sure they believe it. I think it was more like, well, I'll give it a try, and we'll see whether I can seduce this woman.
Well,
so
there's a sort of a gray area in a way,
yes.
And it's sort of hard to really talk about in a way, because we're used to thinking, if I do a certain kind of thing, certain results will happen, and all those kind of things are as you say, they're quantified.
Right.
But when you think about it, there's a lot more going on with the creation of reality than simple something that is like completely irrational. I'll call it.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I come back to when I get into that gray area is to say, let's step back from this and say, where did domesticated plants come from? I mean, the foods that sustain, 8 or 9 billion people, whatever the Earth's population is today, were domesticated, were systematically developed by people in the absence of anything that we would call science. So clearly, and that's just one example, how did indigenous people like the Awajún discover arrow poisons and medicinal plants, some of which we now know to be effective, they're efficacious? They had to do it through attentiveness to their environment and through experimentation and failure. And so to me, it seems preposterous to say, well, we invented science and they didn't have the science. I mean, they had an indigenous science that was based on profound knowledge of the natural world. And that had a cumulative quality. So I always, whenever I read accounts, this isn't as common now as it was, say, 25 years ago, about, the difference between civilization and the primitives. I go, well, wait a minute, we're, all the agricultural systems that allow civilization to emerge, complex, highly dense, stratified societies, they're all based on engagement of indigenous people with the plant world and with the animal world. How did cattle and horses and dogs and sheep and goats get domesticated? I mean, it was a long, many thousands of year process involving systematic encounters between these species and human beings.
I have to ask you about sorcerers, Michael. Your book talks a lot about your encounters with these people. I mean, I've never met a sorcerer. I mean, do you think these people have any sort of use in that society, or are they simply people that have some kind of sacred knowledge about plants and things like that, or do they serve? Obviously, they serve a function in that society, but I don't know. Just tell me about them.
Well, one thing that has to be said about the Awajún, and that is it's not unique to indigenous people in the Amazon, is sorcery. Well, shamanism and sorcery are essentially different facets of the same thing.
Right.
So shamans are healers and sorcerers are killers, but one community's healer is another community's sorcerer. So, and this, as I said, that's not at all unique to the Awajún. And in fact, historically, they had a very high homicide rate that was related to accusations of sorcery. And I found, even though I went to the field, as you said, Angelo, kind of in the spell of Carlos Castaneda, who, by the way, does write a lot about sorcery and not just about shamanism as a healing art. It's also a dark art. And I found that I had to look at it. My feelings became much more ambivalent about shamanism because a lot of it was about identifying sorcerers. And in one case, in a community near where I lived, a young man was identified as a sorcerer and was murdered. I mean, was executed, I guess is the way of putting it. So if you believe that sorcery is real, then when you have reason to believe that somebody is a sorcerer, it's as if you had a killer in your community and he killed once or twice and he'll kill again, and you have to do something as a community. This is in a society without a police force, without a judiciary, without the institutions of law enforcement. It's really based on kinship groups and families. And I found myself, I'm 100% convinced that this young man who was assassinated was a scapegoat. I mean, I don't believe that he really caused the death of a senior man in the community. This man probably had a massive heart attack or a stroke or something like that and just died. But the only way the community could understand that sudden death was by going to a shaman and demanding that he identify who this sorcerer was. When I came to Santa Fe, I was running into people who were practicing shamanism or were interested in shamanism, but they always considered it this kind of wonderful,
benevolent
transcendent
art. Right.
Yeah, and they missed the fact that for much of the world that has this other side, this dark side, and you just don't mess around with this stuff until you know what you're doing.
Michael, we're about the same age, so I have to ask you, where do you come out on the Carlos Castaneda thing? There are people that believe he's a complete charlatan, and people that don't know. He's written several books, very influential, and he's claimed to live with a Yaqui medicine man.
Yeah,
and there are other people that think that he's completely legit. I'll say my own opinion. My own opinion is that it doesn't really matter, but the books are just magical and they're wonderful. But I'm curious as to what yours are.
Yeah, no, I agree. And in fact, one of the first books that was anthropology, because he received a PhD from UCLA. Later, I think UCLA was somewhat embarrassed by that. That's one of the things that drew me into anthropology. And in fact, Alfonso Ortiz assigned that book in his class and we talked about it, and I read all the other ones. I don't know. I think the weight of evidence is that, he may have done he may have had some involvement with the Yaqui, but that the stories that went beyond that, some of that material drew on existing ethnographic accounts. But I agree with you that I think if you can step out of the question of, is it literally true, or is it, does it contain knowledge that's useful and valid? I kind of go with that. I think there was, and I never met Castaneda myself, but I have friends who knew him pretty well in Southern California, and thought he was a really interesting man. There was a famous quote in Time magazine about how he was a enigma wrapped in a tortilla or something like that. But I think there was a significant percentage of what he did that we could. He was an imposter in certain ways, but I think he knew some things, and he deployed that knowledge very effectively. Let me leave it at that. Yeah.
I want to ask you that something that's a little bit closer to your work now, and I understand it's not the totality of your work, and that's about the issue of cultural appropriation. And I'm curious as to where you stand with it.
Oh.
I know millions of people, not millions. I know lots of people, for example, that basically they'll start indigenous ceremonies that they essentially have learned, at least either by reading or by direct transition from native peoples, for example. And then there's the whole question of art. And so I'm just curious as to how you feel about the whole thing.
Well, I'm glad you asked me about that. So after I finished the channeling book, I'd just been exposed to these critiques of cultural appropriation, and I decided to really look at it, because in some ways, if you think about it, it's the idea of stealing a religion is sort of odd. Most of us, at least in the United States, come from world religions where proselytizing is, people actively try and convert others to their belief system, and it's so the idea that we have to get used to the idea that a lot of indigenous people have their own reasons for not really being interested in having that knowledge go beyond the boundaries of their society. So right now I live in northern New Mexico with Pueblo Indian neighbors on all sides, and the Pueblo are famously tight-lipped about the details of their spirituality. And there are public events that, it's funny, I was just talking to our scholars here about some of the feast day events that I love to go to and I consider to be an incredible privilege to be able to go to. And they're open to the public. You can't take photographs. Asking questions about what does this mean and who's doing what and why are not appreciated. You just have to go and experience it. And once you get to know people, they might be a little bit more forthcoming, but knowledge in their world is very strictly controlled, and certain people know certain things and they're allowed and required to know certain things, and other people aren't. And you just have to get used to that. And I'm in my present role, that's something I have to accept, and I do accept. So I don't when I go to Pueblo homes or when I go to Pueblo dances, I don't consider myself an anthropologist. I kind of turn off the anthropology side of my brain, and I experience the generosity, the good fellowship, the beauty of these extraordinary rituals. I mean, we're so lucky to live here. But when you get into things like the appropriation of scientific knowledge or technical knowledge by outsiders. I mean, the classic thing, and there's a lot written about it, is so-called biopiracy. So, a team of scientists from the U.S. goes to, say, the Awajún and collects information on indigenous plants and collects specimens, brings them back. You do bioassays, you discover their active chemicals, you patent the chemicals, and if you're lucky, you realize some vast profit. Because, in fact, a really high percentage of traditionally powerful Western pharmaceuticals they have an origin in indigenous technology. That's a little bit less true today because chemicals are being synthesized and so on. And so the biopiracy there was almost a kind of a panic, a moral panic about biopiracy. It turns out when you get into the details, it didn't happen as much as as is often said. But the fact was, indigenous people saying, "Hey, we shared this knowledge with you. Shouldn't we share in the benefits, the financial benefits of this?" And there are some cases where they really were cheated out of, I think, legitimate rewards for sharing their knowledge. So in the area of biochemical knowledge, in the areas of art, music, those are the design elements that are appropriate, sort of fake Australian Aboriginal art. There's a case that I talk about in one of my books of an Indigenous artist named Johnny Bullen, who was from Northern Australia. He was a very famous artist. He had paintings in some of the national museums and among very serious collectors, and yet his designs started appearing on carpeting that they just were appropriated by a manufacturer, and he eventually sued and won, and so on. But somehow people feel, outsiders feel that they can just take this stuff and not acknowledge where it came from. And it is true that the nature of intellectual property law in the West, by and large, excludes traditional peoples from the kind of protections that, because traditional knowledge, long-standing traditional knowledge, is considered by definition to be in the public domain, and copyright and patents are time limited, so that the idea, and this is actually in the Constitution of the United States. A lot of people don't know that, but that intellectual property law is one of the very specific types of law mentioned in the American Constitution, that the government will protect and provide licenses for invention, which eventually expire. So a patent typically lasts 20 years, and then it goes into the public domain, and anybody can use it. Copyright lasts a lot longer and seems to be continually extended. So the question is how, first of all, sensitizing non-native people to the fact that it's hurtful and unjust to appropriate design elements, stories, oral traditions, biological knowledge without the permission of the communities from which the knowledge comes.
It seems like fundamentally a matter of respect, basically.
I totally agree, Angelo. But I don't know, for some reason, and it seems to happen over and over, and the fashion industry never seems to learn. It seems like every day there's another case of some high-end couture or whatever company that sees a photograph of a really neat, Inuit sweater design or something and starts producing $1,000 sweaters using that design. And then eventually there's some kind of public outrage about that, and they pull it back. And some of the uses are disrespectful. Some of them are just thoughtless and
right.
Unfair. So it's still a contentious issue.
Yeah, it's complicated because there's a case that information wants to be free. So
Absolutely.
there's all this stuff that's just coming out there. You don't even necessarily know where it comes from.
That's right.
You like to listen to jazz as I do. So you're always borrowing from something else.
Right.
So where do we draw the line? It's like something that we just sort of have to work on till we get it right, I guess.
Yeah, and I took some heat in that book and reviews of that book. I mean, there's indigenous advocates who think that we need a regime of law that just covers traditional everything, traditional art, traditional dance, traditional stories. But there are lots of problems with that, and the government has not been a consistent ally of indigenous peoples anywhere. So turning over the protection of your knowledge to the government strikes me as a somewhat questionable approach. On the other hand, and as you say, knowledge moves. I mean, in the digital world, you can slice and dice bits of music, sound samples, visual samples from paintings. It's very hard to trace its ultimate origin. So I do think that mutual respect and education can do a lot. And I see that here in the Southwest. I mean, I'm impressed. Of course, indigenous people appropriate our stuff all the time. I mean, one of the things I wrote about in my book, and I still love this story, is the preferred music of Hopi youth is reggae. And they actually have this great picture of this Hopi, the Hopi guy and I guess an Afro-American with dreadlocks, doing they used to run a summer thing called Reggae and the Res. I'm not sure if it's still going on. And of course, the Navajos, there's just an article in the New York Times about Navajo country Western music, which is their preferred form of music. So, and jazz, of course, it's an interesting case. I mean, there's some people argue that jazz is, an African-American musical form, and there's a lot of truth to that. But of course, it contains elements of the Hispanic music and Western European music and classical music. Yeah. And it's the combination, the hybridity that makes it powerful. It is the probably single most original musical form of the United States. I mean, it's one of our greatest contributions to world culture. But is it owned by African Americans? Well, not exactly. What do you think?
I'm gonna plead ignorance with that one.
Yeah, all right.
It's the same kind of thing. We're talking about respect, right?
Right.
So
right.
Elvis Presley, as you know, he loved black music. He appropriated it,
yeah.
and but still he distanced himself from it to a certain extent, So your people like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, they would just say, "This is the source of my music. I love it," and they would even appear with some people like that. So it's fundamentally a matter of respect. And in the digital age and an age of laws, it just becomes complex for people like you at SAR to figure out what to do with it. Far be it from me to. Let me ask you this to wrap up, Michael. We talked about a lot of things, and I'm just curious. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about kind of what you're interested in these days. I mean, we've talked about. You're still, I'm sure, you're in contact with indigenous people. I mean, what are you interested in? What are your periods of inquiry at the moment?
Well, in terms of my present job, so I'm the CEO of this 112-year-old research institution, and which has three faces. It has a scholarly side, and we have a couple positions for people doing work in Latino studies, and one position for Native American who's doing Native American studies or history, anthropology, archaeology, whatever, and as well as sort of open positions for just the best world scholarship that we can bring. We have a public program that does lectures and so on a range of topics. And then we have this spectacular collection of Native American art at the Indian Arts Research Center. And where, even though we're a small institution in the grand sort of ecology of museums, we're really right at the forefront of new policies of joint stewardship. That is, we have this, say, 6,000 spectacular Pueblo pots, which are from communities in this area. We're working very closely with these communities, with the descendants of the artists who made these things, to make sure that they have access to them for whatever purpose. There are Indian artists. We actually have 3 artist fellowships, and many of them actually go to the collections for inspiration, even though they're doing contemporary work with textiles or ceramics or all kinds of visual art forms. They find inspiration in the work of, say, a century-old pottery design that they apply using new media and so on. So So we're really excited about, so for example, we're working on an exhibition now that's co-funded by a foundation in New York, where the captions for these pots, we'll probably have about 40 of some of the finest Southwestern Pueblo pots in existence. The captions are written by Native people. They're not written by art historians. So we invite potters or community leaders to come in and pick a pot and say, give us 300 or 400 words about what you think this means, who made it, what they were doing, what feelings does it evoke, and those are all being edited and are going to be used for the catalog. So it's a case of, I mean, in the current lingo, it would be decolonizing art history in a way that brings the Native voice to the forefront. And we're totally committed to that. I'm personally totally committed to that and excited by what we're doing. Once I retire from this job, whenever that is, I've got a couple of projects that I've started and I've started to think about. One is about the history of privacy. There are a lot of books on privacy and how we're losing our privacy. I want to go back to the beginning. Like, what is privacy? I mean, for most of human history, human beings actually didn't have privacy. You have to have, for example, I mean, obviously you can go into the forest by yourself and, or I don't know, the African savannas, but really privacy emerges with structures, with houses, and that privacy allows the mystification of certain kind of emergent leaders as shamans or priests or kings. It's the separation of community life. And then, what we consider privacy, which some thinkers argue is essential to just like the creation of the modern self, that we need privacy, personal privacy, to just be the kind of people that we are. And yet, today, millions of people are willing to give up their personal privacy in the interests of fame, in terms of through social media. And if privacy is so important, why are so many people willing to give it up? And what are the implications? What kind of human beings are we becoming precisely because we're increasingly willing to give up our privacy in the interests of financial gain, lower prices, being recognized by other people? It's an interesting question that I don't think
you could make the case that it's something that's gradually going to disappear. I mean, it's already disappearing to a lot of respects. Right.
So then, what would be the implications? What will we be like if it does disappear? I mean, we can talk about the surveillance by the state and all that sort of thing, and those are significant issues. I don't doubt that for a second. But I'm more interested in the question of what kind of self comes to life in a world in which, I mean, maybe we're returning to something that looks a lot more like tribal society, where people had very little personal privacy, and what would be the implications of that? It's interesting. When I have the time, I really want to work through those issues.
Well, I mean, I want to say, I think you're doing wonderful work. We know so little. I mean, we meaning the collective North American, about Indigenous people. Where I live, for example, the Lakota people, their bones are buried everywhere. We know so little about people that, and essentially they were the first people. So the work that you're doing at SAR is very important in a lot of respects. And so we talked about a lot of things, and I want to just sort of wrap up by telling people a little about they want to get more involved in our network, and then I'll say I'll thank you formally. And,
thank you very much. And let me just say, Angelo, that if people are interested in the School for Advanced Research, just look at our website. It's sarweb.org. We're in Santa Fe, and there's a lot of material there, video material and other things, textual material that gives, they could be enlightening for people who are interested in.
Yeah, I'm going to put that in the show notes, and also I'll put something to you. You have several things online which I found interesting, and I want to recommend your book Upriver. I haven't gotten to the channeling book, but I expect to get to as soon as it arrives from Interlibrary Loan.
Okay.
But in any event, any of you want to get more involved or know something about the Diversity and Spirituality Network? We used to call it, now it's the Sacred Inclusion Network. The simplest way is to join our private Facebook group. You could find us by looking for sacredinclusion.com. We have an event every the third Saturday of every week. That's a public event. We have guests like Michael that lead us on various things, And also, if you want to be a supporter of the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. And for as little as $1 a month, you can be, in effect, a sponsor of the show. Michael, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I can't wait to read more of your work. And, I hope we stay in touch.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it.
All right. Let me close this down.